You know, I'm sitting there singing this song. When you don't part the waters, when the answers aren't coming, when there's things in my life that I really wish weren't the way that they are, but I'm still going to trust in you, God. These people aren't just singing it. You out there aren't just singing it. You're living it. I'm looking out at you and I'm thinking about each and every one of you and the struggles that you face. And you're here today to declare to God that even when things don't seem the way I would wish they were, I'm still, at the end of the day, going to trust in you. And that fills my soul with a little bit of sadness, if I'm honest, but a lot of hope and a lot of joy. That has nothing to do with the sermon, but I wanted to share. Okay, folks, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's the question we asked our kids. It's the question that we asked Paxton on his first day of school. You know how they have these little signs, right? And that's the thing now. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents handed me a brown paper bag with a bologna sandwich and an apple and said, make sure you're in kindergarten in an hour. And now it's way, way different. And so my wife bought one of these signs, and you're supposed to fill it out and how much they weigh and what grade they're going into. And there's pictures of him on Facebook standing on our front porch. And so we had to have that conversation to fill in the blanks. Like, what's your favorite thing to do? He said, playing and eating. I said, that's my kid. Well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be a dinosaur wrangler. And I'm not making a story up because that's what he said here. And then I said, that's not a real job, Paxton. He said, in space. So, of course, this is going on social media, so my wife wrote down, astronaut. If you would ask a previous generation what their top 6 professions were, the kids would say stuff like a teacher or a vet or a doctor. I want to be an athlete or a nurse or a scientist, these kinds of jobs. Now, I know you know where I'm going with this. If you ask kids today what their top 6 professions are, their answers are going to be a little different. Athlete's still a big one, teacher's a big one, but then you come in with YouTuber or influencer, which wasn't a thing when I was a kid, an artist or a vet or a gamer. Things have changed over the past few years, but what hasn't changed is that kids want to be the kinds of people they admire. I think teacher makes the list a lot because kids look at their teachers and they admire them. Their teachers are wise, authority figures, and we've had a few bad teachers over the years, but a lot of us can also say we've had some really kind teachers who have made a difference. Or an athlete, someone they see on TV doing amazing things. Kids want to be something that they admire. They want to be the kind of people that they value. And I suppose being a doctor is great and all, but what the world really needs is more Minecraft reaction videos, am I right? You see, kids don't lie, but we do, especially to ourselves. You see, we tell ourselves what really matters is family and faith and being a good person. Character, honesty, integrity, that's what really matters. And yet we spend so much of our time trying to get our kids a great education so that they can go to a good university. And why? Well, so that they can get a good job. Because if you get a good job, you can get a good paycheck and all that goes along with that. And when you have that good paycheck, you can get a good car and a good house and a good spouse and maybe, just maybe, have a couple good kids of your own. And yet James warns us that this is a trap. it's a trap. Last week we dug into the first 8 verses of the book of James, and what is, quite frankly, some pretty difficult teaching on trials. He says that we should count our trials pure joy because they are an opportunity to practice faith, which leads to maturity. And we talked about how we respond to small trials and how that shapes us and our faith. And so when we respond in faith to small trials, then we are mature enough to respond in faith to the big ones when they come a-knocking. Well, this week we keep reading, starting in verse 9. We're going to look at 9 to 18, as James now turns his attention to 2 traps that can threaten to steal us of our joy. The first one is temptation, and the second one is wealth. Well, let's begin, I think, with wealth. Here's what James writes. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. You know, every time I see a rich person driving a nice car or coming out of their big, beautiful house or driving by on their big boat in the harbor, do you know what I think every single time? How humiliating. How embarrassed they must feel having all these nice things. James is shocking in his reversal of social norms. Of course, most of us, we want to be these wealthy people. I can't personally imagine what it would be like to want to buy something more than $200 or $300, even $200 or $300, without having to save up, like for a while. I can't imagine it. Maybe I'm just bad with my money. But for me, that's why I have a Visa card, so I don't have to worry about it. That's future Alton's problem, right? James is intentionally shocking because he wants us to think differently about what we aspire to be when we grow up. He says, the sun rises with scorching heat and it withers the plant, its blossoms fall and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. James wants us to reframe how we think about what we want to be. The power and fame and wealth, they're all great, he says, but like a wild, beautiful flower, they won't last long. However, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Now here James is going back to the first 8 verses of the chapter, and he's reminding us that what really matters at the end of the day is faith in God. After all, why do we strive after wealth if not to manufacture our own sense of security? Right? To be able to go where you want, to do what you want, to buy what you want, to eat what you want, to live where you want. Meanwhile, James points out, and this might touch a sore spot for some people, that true security is not found in ourselves, but in God. And the old saying still is true, that he or she who dies with the most toys still dies. I've lost my PowerPoint again, Aaliyah. When I was 13 years ago, minus the 46 I am now, 14 years ago, I'd just come to Midland. And I had the coolest loft in Toronto with granite countertops and polished concrete floors. It wasn't big, but it was mine, and it was so cool. I was newly married, and we struggled to have a kid. We finally had that kid. Well, here we are in our cool loft with our kid, and I'd never been more miserable. And the reason for it is the relationships weren't good. And so I thought, what if we move to the country and we get that big 4-bedroom house that costs half of what the loft in Toronto cost? And I did. I bought that house and moved up to the Midland area and put all brand new hardwood floors down with the profits from the sale of the condo. New carpets, new eaves troughs. It was fantastic. We moved in. I was so excited to move to Midland, to this area, beautiful church, amazing people, beautiful house. But I was more miserable than ever because the relationships weren't good. And it was then that I really learned a hard lesson in my 30s that none of this stuff matters. The cars, the houses, the granite, the marble, none of that matters at all if the relationships aren't good. And every once in a while, I get sidetracked again with those things. And I always try to remember that Christmas Eve, sitting alone in my beautiful 4-bedroom house, all alone, and realizing that none of it mattered at all. This is the trap of wealth. It's a trap. The false notion that we no longer need God, and the false notion that we no longer need other people that God brings into our lives. The idea that we can take care of ourselves. Well, there's a second trap, and it's the trap of temptation. And James wants to clear something up really quickly. He wants to let us know that God is not the author of temptation. He says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. God is not tempted, and he does not tempt. And that could seem obvious, right? That seems like a pretty obvious statement. At least it does to me, but I can't tell you how many times I've had people come into my office over the years who've said stuff like, why is God tempting me with this great job that's going to pay me so much money, but I'm going to spend so much time away from my family and be miserable? Why would God do that to me? Why would God send me, a recovering addict, to a community that's just rife with drugs? Why would God tempt me like that? And of course, why would God make pizza taste so good when it's so bad for me? You know, it is so great to be able to blame God for our temptations. But James has some cold water to throw on us. He says, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. James is clear. It's our own evil desires that tempt us. And honestly, we don't need much help, do we? We really don't. Every single time that my kids come up to me and say, I'm hungry, I cannot resist saying, I'm Daddy, nice to meet you. I know they hate it, but the temptation is too great. when our evil desires that James talks about and our temptations, they hook up, well, what happens is they begin a family tree that leads to sin. And then another sin, and then another sin, until you have this whole population of baby sins. And when they're fully grown, he says, they lead to death. This goes back to verse 12. I don't know if you remember, we just read it a few seconds ago, where he talks about the crown of life. So James holds out for us two options, life and death. Life and death. Now, sometimes we're talking literal death because obesity, smoking, drug abuse are responsible for a lot of death. And the pursuit of wealth, well, it often leads to war, the murdering of our planet, unsafe working conditions, especially in developing countries that don't provide protection for people the way some others do. I don't know if you've ever heard about the radium girls. Ever hear about, I'm into watches, you know that I have a YouTube channel, and I started hearing about these radium girls. In 1917, they realized, manufacturing companies who made clocks and watches, realized that they could paint this material on watches, on clocks, and it would glow in the dark. And they were told that this is perfectly safe, and they set up factories in the United States all throughout the 20s, and they said, dip your pen, your felt pen or whatever it is, or your brush, into the ink, and then paint it on. But before you do that, you want a nice fine tip. So here's what you need to do. Lick it. We've all done it. We've all done some brushing, or we've tried to get some thread through a needle, and we put that in our mouth. And so that's what they did. Lick the tip of the brush, dip it in, paint it on. They started to get creative. Some of them would paint their teeth. Then they'd go home at night, show their husband how their teeth glow in the dark. It was a really neat thing. The reason that they did it that way was because if they dipped it in water, it would wash away some of the material. And then they found out, after people started dying, that it was radioactive. And it was a terrible, terrible way to die. So many of these women, the radium girls, died because the manufacturer wanted to save a little bit of money in the material that would be washed away. And so death can happen because of our sin when it's fully born. It gives birth to sin, and it gives birth to death. But don't overlook the other, more insidious death that occurs when we give into our desires and our temptations. Because every time that we choose good over evil, we choose death over life, and it diminishes who we are. It steals a little piece of our soul. And you may not notice it at first, but after years of making the choice to choose sin over God's way, evil over good, you will find that it leaves a mark on your soul. It changes who you are. I read a blog post on desiringgod.org that I think makes the problem of our sinful desires all too clear. They write, they encourage us to nurture a fantasy that the world we perceive is our world. And in this fantasy world, we ought to possess what we desire and the things ought to go our way. The more we indulge this fantasy, the more we want it to be true. It feeds and expands our sinful desire appetites. It increasingly shapes our thinking and our behavior. And if not resisted and battled vigorously, we will eventually pursue as real an image that we created. Also known by another word, idolatry. It is so insidious, the temptations that we face. You don't even notice it in the beginning. Telling ourselves that we are God, that we can manufacture our own happiness. And this is a great deception. It's a trap that we fall into again and again. James continues, "Don't be deceived, my brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of the truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all that he created." James has said that God does not tempt, right? He's made that clear. But do you know what he does? Every good and perfect gift comes from God. Don't kid yourself, James says. God, who is eternal character and his eternal nature that has not changed since the day he said, "Let there be light," wants only what is best for you. All the good that you experience in this world, that was his idea. Grace, his idea. Kindness, his idea. Family, love, his idea. And salvation, oh, that's his idea too. And he was willing to pay the price for it. You see, while temptation can lead to death, the gift of God is new birth. And what does James say? New birth through what means? Or more correctly, new birth through whom? Well, the word of truth. And I can't help but think of the opening lines of the Gospel of John when I read that. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now, I'm not going to say that I'm never tempted. That's for sure. Especially on Friday night when I see pizza. And I can't say that I don't sometimes dream about what it would be like to have enough money in my bank account that I'd never have to pull out my Visa card ever again. These are two traps that are easy to fall into: temptation and wealth. But the older I get, the more I come to realize just how fleeting these things are and what is truly important. And I hope that I can pass that along to my kids so that one day I can brag to my friends that Paxton is not just a dinosaur wrangler in space, but he also knows the word of the Lord and the gift of God that he freely gives to all who ask. Because at the end of the day, the question still is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And what is it going to take to get there? Let's pray.